rural America elected him by a wide margin. Now President Donald Trump takes office, and he wastes no time carrying out his agenda with big implications for rural America, especially in agriculture, on issues like trade, tariffs, immigration, and more.
Quite frankly, we're going to have the farmer's friend, and that's Donald J. Trump.
Farmers say it'll be a farmer-friendly administration, and we'll hear from producers. Plus, President Trump acting on ethanol, but why growers would like to see more.
That's a good lesson to pay attention to the fine print.
And the University of Nebraska rewrites the book on nitrogen with some big changes to fertilizer recommendations to prevent nitrate issues.
But I got a barn camera there.
And later, calving season arrives with an Arctic blast. We'll see how some ranchers get another set of eyes. It's time to grow. Husker scientists rewrite the book on nitrogen fertilizer. I'm Steve White. It's all about protecting the farmer's bottom line, but also protecting our important groundwater resource.
Here, this well out here, when we started in 1986, it was somewhere between 24 and 28 parts per million.
High nitrates in his family well forced Curtis Rorick to cut back on fertilizer.
It's cleaning up the water. It's taken time, but it was a great program.
That program came from regulations the Central Platte Natural Resources District issued in the 80s.
Met with a lot of resistance.
Rorick said farmers were reluctant to produce fertilizer.
There was a minimum, a blanket you threw 200 pounds on, maybe more. Nitrogen was cheap, and you were going after high bushels, and that was the way to get after it.
Now nitrate hotspots light up on the map, the legacy of too much fertilizer that leached into the groundwater.
You start to push towards maximizing yield and not necessarily maximizing profit, then that starts to allow nitrate to accumulate and move into the groundwater.
In 2015, Dr. Richard Ferguson began a new research project with a novel concept. That technology has now been commercialized, using satellite mapping to show farmers like Rorick when to fertilize.
How green it is to show how much nitrogen is there. And, they look at it, we come up with a plan.
Ferguson says the data is conclusive as he rewrites the university's guidelines with significant changes. Do you have some pretty high hopes that this kind of technology could make a real dent?
Well, personally, I see it as the future. I think for farmers, it will be beneficial economically, and for the population of the state, it will be beneficial long-term. Environmentally.
Applying nitrogen fertilizer in the fall or a large application pre-planting is not recommended. The new guidance calls for most fertilizer to be applied during the growing season, shown to maximize profitability and reduce the environmental impact.
Bottom line is the dollar, and that's what we're chasing.
Rorick saw added expense and paperwork when regulations took effect in the 80s, but now says it's the best thing that could have happened. The nitrate level in his well is half what it was, and now sensor-based technology brings a new level of precision, even if there's more work during the growing season.
Change is tough, but I think if they look at the science and the facts and the data, that they'll find that they can do it.
And while these are guidelines, scientists say it's based on years of data and on-farm research, and they hope producers will begin to implement some of these practices. One of President Trump's first actions giving a boost to corn growers.
What is this?
Hours on the job, the new president showed his support for the American farmer.
Quite frankly, we're going to have the farmer's friend, and that's Donald J. Trump.
One of Trump's first actions clears the way to sell higher blends of corn-based ethanol.
It's great to have E15 top of mind with the president and in the executive orders. But what we really need is the national fix for E15, which is a fairly simple legislative fix.
Farmer Jan Ten Benzel says Trump's order is good news, but the president's hands are tied. By law, E15 waivers are temporary and need to be renewed every 20 days.
That's a good lesson to pay attention to the fine print.
It's why the Nebraska Corn Growers Association supports legislation to allow nationwide year-round sales of E15. Senator Deb Fischer proposed just that, and for a moment it was included in the government funding package until the deal fell apart.
Snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, as they say, but
Ten Benzel is undeterred, and some farmers in this organization say it's time to push the limits, allowing cars to use gasoline blended with 20 or 30% ethanol.
E15 is the near-term solution, but the long-term solution, as the use of gasoline goes down, the gas tank gets smaller, we will go to an E30 program, an E20 program.
Ten Benzel remembers selling corn for $1.40, wondering if he'd made a mistake.
Ethanol brought about a golden age where we had a steady market for our corn.
Trump's nominees for EPA and USDA have been associated with groups opposing ethanol in the past. But for the president to show support for biofuels on day one is a positive for farmers.
The more corn we move, the better. And with the governor's program of wanting to value add everything we can in the state, we march it off the farm on the hoof or in the tanker as ethanol, one of the two.
And while farmers were excited to see ethanol as part of the day one policy, they've also got some reservations about the possibility of new tariffs that could negatively impact agriculture.
Well, I'm not a fan of tariffs, to be quite honest. I also believe they need to be a tool in the toolbox. And Canada and Mexico, for example, they've tried to shut out some of our products. They've successfully done that in many cases. Mexico most recently tried to shut out our biotech corn. Incidentally, that comes from my district largely, and yet my concern is even broader than that the world is watching.
Nebraska corn drives this state's economy. Chris Graham's outgoing president of the Nebraska Corn Growers. You've got a lot to be thankful for in terms of the last year of what Nebraska corn growers have been up to.
Yeah, it's been a huge year. I mean, whether it's a checkoff increase, whether it's a USMCA, Mexico decree on white corn, not allowing it, huge win. Thank you to Andy Jobman on that one. I mean, he was a ringleader of that one, and then National got involved, and here we are. We got it done, and it's a big win for Nebraska corn.
Besides paying attention to what the legislature's doing and then having a special session, I mean, it just, the work never ends.
No, it doesn't. And there were quite a few trips made to Lincoln for testifying for Nebraska corn, and that's what we're here for. Yeah, we have our operations back home, but we got to be the voice for Nebraska farmers.
You know, when you go, whether it's in D.C. or in Lincoln, and you can say, hey, I'm a guy who's got some acres back home, and here's my thing, and I'm raising a family. Do you think that they enjoy, those folks in those offices enjoy hearing from somebody who's an actual producer?
Absolutely. They love it when we get our boots on the ground. They love to hear our personal stories because it means more to them than just a phone call or a representative going over and saying, hey, these guys need this. Well, if we can make the trip and say, we need this now, it's a better benefit for us and them.
So somebody has not gotten involved in your organization. What's your pitch? Give me the elevator pitch of why should they get involved then.
You know, we would love to see everybody involved. Obviously, there's not as many spots as we want to, but we're getting our boots on the ground for everybody. Not only corn farmers, but it's for those families, those kids, those second generations that might not even be here yet. We want to get them involved so the ag in Nebraska can stay here.
And your award winner this year, I don't know how you found this guy.
Yeah.
The Golden Ear.
The Honorable Steve White won the Golden Ear Award. Huge advocate for Nebraska farmers, not only corn, but all of our commodities. We thank you very much, Steve, for everything you do.
Well, thank you. I just, in all sincerity, I do appreciate getting out there, and I do try to make sure you guys, I've got all your phone numbers. You get a text or a call, and we try to make sure that you guys are getting on TV. Maybe you get a little tired of that, but we try to spread the love and hear from producers.
And you guys do a great job of telling our story. And it's not always me that Steve calls. It's Michael. It's numerous other growers. At our meeting today, I actually had the people raise their hands who hadn't been contacted by Steve. So Steve's going to have some new blood. You guys are going to see some new blood on NTV News.
There you go. But in terms of, you mentioned it, but just you're trying to grow your numbers, you're trying to get new members, and it looks like you've got a great staff. It's been a number of years now where Nebraska Corn has been kind of unified as a team between the growers and the corn board, the checkoff side of things, and it looks like as an organization things are onward and upward.
Yep, it's been huge ever since we got to the same office. Everybody's on the same story. No, there's no driving back and forth trying to get words where we want them. So it's huge that we're under the same roof, and we're one big family now.
And one of those wins we haven't really mentioned, but that checkoff, we talked a little bit about the legislature getting that checkoff increased in the last year. That was a pretty big win.
It was. I mean, was it the right time? Probably not, because the markets were down. But at every moment in someone's life or company's life, you know, you got to make that next step to make yourself bigger and better, and that's what we're trying to do.
Well, Chris, thanks for your service, and I guess you'll continue your service by still being involved on the board.
Absolutely. I won't leave here.
All right, thanks so much. Two past presidents of the Nebraska Cattlemen now providing national leadership. Barb Cooksley of Anselmo will chair a committee for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. Cooksley will lead the Property Rights and Environmental Management Committee. Barb and her husband George have been honored for their work on conservation, highlighting sustainability practices, something you may have seen right here last summer as we honored the Cooksleys as our Farm Family of the Month. Barb is joined by Mike Drennan, who feeds cattle near Palmer and Columbus. Drennan will serve as chair of NCBA's Live Cattle Marketing Committee. He, too, has been active advocating on the state level. Still to come, we visit with Dr. Richard Ferguson as the longtime University of Nebraska scientist rewrites the rules on nitrogen. New guidance on in-season applications of nitrogen fertilizer. I'm Steve White, visiting with Dr. Richard Ferguson, soil scientist and extension as well. And it's not every day a new NEB guide comes out. That's kind of the, you know, when you distill the information down into something kind of bite-sized that the producer can use, and you've got a new one. And it's pretty significant, I would say.
We think so. We hope so. It's just out this winter, and we're starting to do some information meetings with growers through winter extension events.
And tell people, the conclusion is kind of right there at the top. What is kind of the conclusion that has been drawn?
Well, the NEB guide is oriented primarily towards irrigated corn production right now. The concepts are relevant to rain-fed dryland corn as well, but they're not as easily implemented, maybe in dryland corn. But the idea is to now, with the technology that's available, to move more of our fertilizer application into the growing season. When the crop is actively growing, we can use the crop as an indicator of need for nitrogen, so we don't have to predict what the fertilizer rate is months ahead of the growing season. And it also allows us to have an actively growing root system so that the nutrients are used more efficiently.
So in essence, are we saying that fall application, we're not going to recommend that?
That is a change. The university has always allowed some capacity for fall application, recognizing that spreads the workload for growers and dealers. But no longer are we including that in our recommendations. We think the efficiency gains and actually increased profitability that come with delaying application outweigh the advantages to applying fertilizer in the fall.
And then talk to me about a pre-plant application there again. Are we suggesting maybe that we don't need to go as hard that direction as maybe producers have in the past?
So in Grand Island and much of the state, really the wettest months are May and June. Those are our highest rainfall months. So if we can avoid having significant nitrogen fertilizer in the soil during those months, saving the application more towards in the growing season in June, July, that avoids the risk of loss of fertilizer to groundwater eventually. So significant even pre-plant application. So applying most of your fertilizer in March or early April, we would probably discourage as well. We do recognize there needs to be some nitrogen applied at the time of planting, close to that, to get the crop going into the growing season. And our new NEB guide describes that as well.
We'll continue our conversation with Dr. Ferguson next week. Still to come, Gary Robinson Jr. joins us.
The Florida Panhandle saw more snow this week than Nebraska has all winter.
this week's drought monitor that was released this past Thursday. Of course, if you're a fan of changing weather, this one is not for you. We look pretty similar compared to last week. Of course, even though those temperatures have changed quite a bit in the last week. Again, that drought monitor, of course, the lack of precipitation, they both have not. A closer look now at the state of Kansas, where it looks the exact same once again. 35.25% under no drought, 64.75% of the state under abnormally dry conditions. Still have moderate drought, standing at roughly 24.75% of the state, most of that over the northern part of the state. Moving up north to Nebraska, we're of course also at the exact same as last week. Again, about 2.4% of the state in no drought, abnormally dry. Of course, accumulates for the remaining 97.6% of the state. Moderate drought now stands about 88.75%. Severe drought still stands roughly 46%. Extreme drought still about 8.25% for that. Most of that out in the northwest part of the state. Good news is still no exceptional drought. Of course, there's one positive takeaway from the drought monitor not changing with the lack of precipitation we've had. And again, it is not changing to any worse categories. Otherwise, temperatures for the month of February looking at relatively below normal temperatures for the northern and eastern parts of Nebraska. Southwest tip of Kansas maybe expecting slightly above average. Otherwise, the rest is looking at relatively average temperatures for February. Looking at precipitation, maybe slightly drier conditions expected for the western part of Kansas, maybe getting into the extreme southwest corner there of Nebraska. Otherwise, relatively average precipitation totals are expected. Maybe some good news on that front. We could certainly use some moisture out there. Next 3 months, temperature-wise, that is, looking at relatively below normal temperatures for a good chunk of Nebraska. Meanwhile, the rest of Nebraska and Kansas looking at relatively average temperatures for the next 3 months. Looking at the precipitation totals, next 3 months looking at relatively dry, of course, conditions for a good chunk of Nebraska, as well as Kansas. Otherwise, the eastern parts of both Nebraska and Kansas probably closer to normal. We will see for those precipitation totals. Your Grow Almanac here for the week ahead. Again, a normal high stands right around 37 this time of year. Normal low is about 16. Of course, we are starting the week off on a very warm note. We're going to be running well above average, 47 the average high this next week. The average low also a little bit warmer than normal at 22. Of course, you'll see why. We're starting off the week on a very nice note. Those temperatures getting into the 50s for us. It's going to be a fantastic week. Maybe get outside and enjoy this nice weather while it lasts. I think we actually could be tracking our next system towards the tail end of the week, something to keep an eye on. Otherwise, a mild week it will be. Of course, it kind of ties into our Grow proverb. But I think you'll see a lot of westerly winds this next week, too. Wind from the west, weather at the best. What is that going to ring true this next week? That is Locate Your Grow Weather Report. Stay tuned next week when once again it'll be time to grow.
We've had that blast of Arctic air and some snow flurries, but nothing like what they've seen down south. More snow in the Florida Panhandle than we've seen in central Nebraska. NTV's Gary Robinson Jr. has more on how drought is impacting the Cornhusker State.
It's surprising.
A lot of people, it's just like, wow, the South actually gets snow.
And a lot of it compared to how much Nebraska has received.
Look at, Mobile, Alabama, 7.5 inches of snow they got down there.
I spoke with our own meteorologist, Kyle Kleckner, who explained why we're experiencing a dry winter.
Unfavorable pattern shape up, northwesterly flow typically indicates drier patterns because all that dry air from Canada is moving down from the north and west.
A year ago, only 40% of the state was in drought. And according to this drought monitor, now nearly 98% of Nebraska is experiencing dry conditions, leaving 1.7 million Nebraskans experiencing at least moderate drought or worse. And many of those are farmers. David Grimes has owned his farm for 17 years. He's concerned by the lack of subsoil moisture and only has some surface moisture down a few inches from November rain he received. But he is also staying optimistic.
We will need rain in the spring to build up the subsoil for the next year for the rangeland and the pastures and also the farm ground that get crops planted. And we've got time to get that yet, so we hope and pray for rain and for some timely rain without hail and wind in the summer as well.
Ranchers calving during extreme cold don't get much sleep, but technology gives peace of mind. I'm Steve White in Miller, where this rancher using cameras to protect his investments. Layers for himself, even more for his herd. As Brock Elson slides open the door to this nearly century-old barn, it's clear it's seen some upgrades.
I got a barn camera there, and then I got 2 hot boxes in that I warm the calves up with on these cold days.
Inside, temps may be 30 degrees warmer, making all the difference for newborn calves.
Last night when I was out checking, it was -15 wind chills, what it's supposed to feel like when I was out checking in the middle of the night. I try to keep it above 20 degrees in these barns at all times and stuff if I can, to help, keep the calves warm and stuff, because it's kind of, until they get eating and nursing and stuff, it's kind of a crunch time for them.
Those calves are the future of his operation, but keeping an eye on them doesn't always mean braving the cold.
Right here that I control it with.
His barn is wired with 4 cameras he can watch on his phone or on the living room TV.
They've saved a couple calves. I mean, like I said, it's paid for itself easily.
One camera allows him to zoom a quarter mile away with clarity, but it's the view in the calving barn that lets him know if it's time to intervene.
This way you can just let them do their natural thing, and you can be just a little fly on the wall, and they don't even know you're watching them. So.
It saves him a few trips in the cold, but ranching remains hands-on.
If I get more than 3 to 4 hours sleep a day, that's pretty good for me. So especially during this cold weather. During the nice weather, I maybe get a little more. During the cold weather, I probably get a little less.
There's always work to do, more so on days like this when equipment doesn't work.
They only break down on weekends, holidays, and cold days. I figured that out.
Still, all part of his mission to put Nebraska beef on your dinner table.
These cows this is what provides for my family, and this is why we do what we do. I mean, this is what God put me on earth to do.
Well, that's going to do it for this week. We'll see you back here again next time as we see how agriculture makes Nebraska grow.